Welcome, everyone, to Voice of Republicans TV, where we bring you politicians, activists, and candidates straight with no slant. Please like and subscribe our channel as we bring you new episodes every week. We're here today with special guest, Congressman Andy Harris of Maryland's 1st Congressional District. We'll be speaking with the Congressman about everything from protests, riots, civil unrest, the economy, and the COVID-19 response, and what Congress is doing to help us out of the situation.
Congressman Andy Harris has spent his life serving his neighbors, his country, and his community, whether it was as a physician at Johns Hopkins, or as a medical officer in the Naval Reserve, or as a state senator, and now as your congressman. Congressman Andy Harris has been serving the 1st Congressional District since 2010 and has continued to serve his constituents with dignity, honor, and commitment.
Good evening, Congressman, and thank you for joining us here.
It's great to be with you.
Thank you. Let's get right into it. The Black Lives Matter movement has shined a light nationally on policing and policing practices and how our police departments are run. We've seen some cities like Minneapolis already commit to disbanding their police, while others are looking at defunding. Question for you is, should this be handled at a state level, a federal level? What should the role be of the federal government in the way these police departments are handled and their ability to either disband or defund police locally?
Sure. So first of all, we already have methods in place and laws in place that make what happened in to George Floyd a federal offense. That is, basically, we have civil rights violations. Pretty clearly, civil rights were infringed there. And so those laws are already in place, but that should probably be the limit of the extent of federal involvement. The bottom line is that law enforcement is generally, in most instances, a very localized function where the police department knows best what works best in the communities in which they operate. And of course, we have to remember that being a law enforcement officer is just one of the toughest jobs in the world. You never know what you're going to come up against on the shift you have. You never know what kind of dangerous person you're going to come in contact with. And although it's cliched, it's true. When you leave your family in the morning, they don't know whether they're going to see you at the end of your shift. The overwhelming percent of our officers, our law enforcement officers, our men and women in uniform do a great job. They're doing the appropriate job. And I believe we already have protections in place that deal with the times when an officer, like the officer involved in the George Floyd incident, acts very inappropriately.
Thank you, Congressman Harris, which leads us to a follow-up question. So do you believe that police should be defunded when we need more police now, especially when we need training and money for non-lethal weapons and responses?
Absolutely. So your point is absolutely correct. The bottom line is, if anything, we actually need more funding right now for two reasons. One is that the last few weeks have shown an increasing trend of violence, and you don't solve violence with less police activity. That just doesn't work. And if you think, for instance, that our police are not trained adequately, for instance, in cultural differences, in how to deal and how to de-escalation, things like that, how to deal with psychologically or psychiatrically impaired patients, then the answer is more training, which takes funding, not less funding. That is a foolish endeavor that doesn't lead to good results. And to be honest with you, we're seeing those results in some of the major American cities led by liberal Democrats.
And you touched on it in your response there for what my follow-up was going to be, is we've seen recently spikes in violence in major cities and increasingly disturbing spikes in violent crimes in these major cities. I would think that even Democrats don't actually think that you can somehow reduce these crime rates by removing the law enforcement. What do you think is actually the end game here, I guess is the way to put it, as far as trying to remove police officers when we're seeing less strict policing is already increasing violence? Where do you think this is headed?
Look, I'm going to disagree with you to some extent. I think there really are people who do believe that you actually have less crime with fewer police. I don't understand that logic. I never understand that logic, but there are some people who truly believe that that's true. And I think that's very, very dangerous. I think a vast majority of Americans believe that the thin blue line is in fact there to protect them, and that without that thin blue line, we will have anarchy.
So, Congressman Harris, some people are saying that the Black Lives Matter movement is a destructive organization, and we've seen the destruction of statues, like in Maryland, the Christopher Columbus statue, and others around the country. So, what is the appropriate response for people that are destroying property through rioting?
Sure. So, we have to separate what we'll call the black, and I'll put in air quotes, the Black Lives Matter movement from the Black Lives Matter Foundation, after which it's named, which is clearly a Marxist organization that is intent on destroying the nuclear family, things like this. It is not in any way, shape, or form. What they stand for is not going to result in the improvement of America or in a decrease in racism in America. But again, if you want to peacefully protest that in fact racism, some elements of it still clearly exist in America right now, that's fine. But when you cross the line into violence, whether it's violence by throwing a Molotov cocktail, looting and breaking into a store, destroying a statue, pulling down a statue. In the case in Baltimore, pulling down a Christopher Columbus statue, throwing it into the which was bought with private donations, and throwing it into the Inner Harbor. I've got to tell you, that's a crime. It should be a federal crime if it involves federal monuments, and we should strictly enforce that law to stop that behavior.
Thank you, Congressman. And we see these lines blurred, getting very blurred between Confederate monuments. Then it moved into founding father monuments, and now we've even seen statues to men like Frederick Douglass be targeted and Abraham Lincoln targeted. Uh, do you think there's a certain way that we should deal with those who actually do want to see those Confederate monuments moved to a museum or elsewhere, as opposed to the founding father monuments that not too long ago President Trump was heckled for suggesting that that's who they'd come after next? Do you see a way that we can deal with the two groups of statues differently and sort of keep everyone happy?
Well, what we have to add now, of course, is we're seeing actually statues in churches being destroyed as well. So this has gone well beyond Civil War statues. Look, the first rule has to be you can't destroy anything that's not yours. You just can't do it. In this country, that's illegal, should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law, which means that if you want to have these statues removed, there are ways to do it. These statues, again, and if it's a private statue, such as a statue at a church, I'm sorry, you have no say in that. If it's on public property, then what you do is you go to the public political entity, whether it's your city council, town council, state government, and you address it at that level. With legislators making that decisions, with politicians making that decision, who are then held responsible in the next election if they don't make the decision that you think is appropriate. But that's the way it should be done in a country where law and order is respected. We should have zero tolerance for destruction of someone else's property. And again, this is not the trend. We know from the original riots in Baltimore in 2015. We know that when the mayor famously said we have to give people room to destroy, that is incorrect. It's un-American. We are a nation of law and order, and that has to be one of our foundation principles. And when we have leaders saying that destruction is appropriate in any way, shape, or form, that has crossed the line.
So, Congressman, President Trump has labeled Antifa as a terrorist organization. And as we see ongoing nightly violence in places like Portland, Oregon, what should the federal response be in dealing with this organization?
It is a domestic terrorist organization. There's no question about it. We shouldn't tolerate violent protesters who are masked to hide their identity, going into cities and stirring up what amounts to insurrection. Antifa and look, they're clear. They're honest about it. They want to overturn the American way of life and probably the American governmental system right now. That is insurrection. That's one of the purest definitions of insurrection. If the president has to institute the Insurrection Act or take actions under it, he should. We have to have zero tolerance for violent protests, especially ones that are backed by Antifa.
Congressman, we've seen it seems to be an unwillingness from the other side to actually speak out forcefully against Antifa and those who are sympathetic to Antifa. I saw just last night the mayor of Portland went to meet with the protesters and rioters and side with them. And it ended with him being heckled and driven out of the event, and they were chanting for him to resign as well. Is there at least some behind the scenes effort you're seeing, or behind the scenes unwillingness to just go along with the far left pulling the Democrat Party, pulling Joe Biden, pulling the entire party towards that radical far left fringe? Is there anyone still truly moderate in the Democrat Party, I guess?
Well, I don't know, but I think this is going to be a very clear decision point in the November election. I mean, Americans are going to want to know, how do you stand? Do you stand with the people, or do you stand with Antifa? And Portland's an interesting the case in Portland's very interesting, because there's a mayoral race coming up this November, and the Democrat mayor is being challenged by a person who brags about being part of Antifa. So it's like, which one of us is going to be more disrespectful of law and order? That has to end. And I think that Americans are going to ask the people, before they go into the voting booth or vote by mail this November. They are going to ask tough questions, and one of the questions is: do you stand with us, or do you stand with the violent terrorists who are now stalking our streets?
I think anyone who wants a just safe place to live and be left alone, that should be an easy question for them. Stay tuned, everyone, and we will be right back after this short break. And we're back with Congressman Andy Harris as we move on to the economy, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and the congressional response. Maria?
Thanks, Evan. So Congressman Harris, Senator Mitch McConnell mentioned this past Tuesday that a second round of stimulus checks is going to be talked about. What does this look like for the American people? And could you comment on anything that the House is doing with that?
Well, of course, the House took the ridiculous position that we need a $3 trillion stimulus and COVID package, which is what was passed out of the House. It was called the HEROES Act. I voted against it. We cannot spend $3 trillion more at this point. There's no indication that we need that amount of money. We're waiting to see what the Senate does. The rumor is that the Senate package will be, and I put it in quotes, a mere $1 trillion, which is a number that was really, you wouldn't even think about spending that amount of money in a what's called an emergency expenditure. But the key is going to be, I think, making sure that we do extend some unemployment benefits, because again, the government has basically shut down some businesses and basically thrown some people out of employment. So the government does have the responsibility of making those people almost whole. The idea of paying someone more on unemployment than they got working, I think, is a very bad idea for the American economy, and it's resulting in a much slower economic recovery than we otherwise would have had. So I think the new package has to have some unemployment benefit extension. I disagree. I don't think it needs local and state government help right now, unless we put in very serious provisos that we are not bailing out states like Illinois and California, which are basically going to go bankrupt because of their luxurious spending and their overburdened pension systems in those states. We probably need some elements of money for education, if it's going to be in classroom education, because if you conduct in classroom education now, you do have additional expenses for PPE and other things that have to be done. You may need more school buses, for instance, things like that. So there will be more money needed for that. But a school system that decides that they are not going to have in school teaching, I think, should get no additional federal dollars. The bottom line is, it's actually cheaper to educate a student if you don't have to open up a school and open up a classroom. So I'm not sure why any school system would need more money to educate online or distance education. Beyond those, there's probably going to be some amount of monies for some additional testing. And of course, if we need more money for vaccines or treatments, we should include that in the bill.
Congressman, I want to jump ahead, and as a doctor, you have a unique insight to this virus that many of your colleagues may not have. You have an understanding of it that most of us will never have. Can you tell us a little bit about, over this course of this pandemic, what you've learned about this virus as the news keeps changing? And could you also give us a little insight as to why it seems the experts or the so-called experts um, seem to contradict what their recent message was so many times, and it seems like over and over again, as things develop, what they've told us to do before seems to be the opposite of what they tell us to do next. Can you just tell us a little bit from your medical background what you know about this?
Sure. So the key is that this is a virus that we've never seen before. I mean, it's a class of virus we've seen, but not this specific, SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID. So we've learned we've had to go from knowing nothing about this virus at the beginning of the year to basically knowing how to treat and prevent it as fast as we can. And we've learned a lot along the way. So, for instance, in the beginning, we were told in China, and they lied about it. They said, we don't think there's human-to-human transmission. We think it's rare, if it's present at all. But it turns out there was human-to-human transmission. It actually was quite easy to transmit this virus, especially since people who are asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic. So people who may never develop symptoms may be able to transmit it. They don't even know they have the disease. And people for a few days before they become symptomatic also are able to transmit it. So we've learned that, for instance. That's why wearing a mask is a good recommendation now, because you don't know if you have this virus. Now, I will tell you, if you've had the virus and you've recovered, you shouldn't have to wear a mask, because there's very good evidence that you are not going to be spreading this disease, and that there's really very little evidence that you can get this disease a second time, the exact same COVID disease. So we've learned things along the way. We've learned a lot along the way, and we should change the way we approach things based on what we learn. For instance, I'm convinced, if you look at the data now, that New York is actually probably very close to herd immunity, because despite opening up, the number of hospitalizations has leveled off and not increased. The number of deaths have gone down despite opening up, which means that there must be some intrinsic immunity in the community that is restricting the further spread. So we don't understand all the immune response, and I can get technical about T cells and B cells, but there's a very technical, there is a complicated response to this virus that we don't fully understand. But I think the indication is that there are more people who've had it or are immune to it than we think there are. And two, we've developed tremendous treatments over the last few months, to the credit of the Trump administration, because they through Operation Warp Speed have accelerated FDA approvals, FDA testing processes. The death rate now, because we've become so much better at treating people, we know when to put them on a ventilator, when not to. We put way too many people on ventilators in the beginning. We have remdesivir, which probably decreases the death rate by at least a half. Dexamethasone, which also decreases the death rate, convalescent plasma antibody treatment that decreased the death rate. The death rate, I think, now is probably only a third of what it was when we began. We've gotten that good at treating it. So actually, as a fatal disease, it's become much less likely to be a fatal disease now, which of course is what we all worried about, is that we can get it, God forbid, and you can die from this. There's much less to worry about in terms of that now. Now, are we still having diseases in Florida, Texas, places like that? Yeah, but if you look at it, it's much better than it ever was in New York. New York was probably the worst possible scenario you could have. Certainly the governor's response there, sending nursing home patients back to nursing homes with COVID, was probably a very bad idea. But again, we've learned a lot over the past few months. I'm much more optimistic. And that's why, for instance, I call for schools reopening. We know that for school-age children, especially elementary-age children, they are safer in school now than they would be sending them in a normal school year, in a normal flu year. The school is actually safer for them than staying at home.
Well, thank you so much, Congressman Harris. We appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today. Just wanted to give you a moment if you'd like to wrap things up and any final thoughts you may have.
Sure. So we have a lot of things facing us. The most important thing is we have to get our economy back on track, which means we have to end the shutdowns as soon as we can safely. I would urge everyone listening to this. Look, I know there are a lot of people out there who say, for instance, if you make me wear a mask, you're violating my liberties, my freedoms. I would ask everybody to understand that when you wear a mask, it's not to protect you. It's to actually protect the people around you in case you are pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic. And I would hope we all care enough about our fellow Americans and our fellow citizens that we would want to protect them. And it's a small price to pay in order to get that protection. It's probably the number one thing that you can do. Besides, obviously, if you're symptomatic, get tested, quarantine yourself, stay away from other people until you're certain it's not COVID that you have. Those simple measures plus washing your hands, if you combine those three measures, we can deal with this until we get a vaccine, which I think, again, thanks to the Trump administration, is going to be very, very soon. Clearly, by the end of the year, we will have a licensed vaccine, and because we're manufacturing them simultaneously with the testing process, again, never been done before for a drug. Since we're doing that, we will be able to protect our vulnerable population. We'll be able to begin protecting them clearly before the end of the year. I think maybe even as early as the end of October. So I'm very, very hopeful about that. And once we get COVID out of the way, we can get our economic rebound back into gear because we had the best economy ever going into this COVID, and we will have the best global economy coming out of it.
Thank you so much, Congressman, for joining us here on Voice of the Young Republicans on Voice of Republicans TV. Always enjoy the chance to talk with you and steal a little bit of your time and your insight. Thank you to everyone for joining us and tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to all of the Voice of Republican social platforms so you never miss an episode.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Congressman.